talk about a few things before we bring the guest up. You know, the United States has been the land of opportunity and dreams, truly, since its inception. I would guess in this room, 50% of the people in this room are at the most 2 generations away from being immigrants themselves. In fact, I think if you ask the American Indian, he'd tell you you're all here illegally. We have a history of debate on the immigration issue, a debate that changes, the culture changes, as the economy changes, and the issues of race and religion as they change. However, we know that some of the greatest advances in science and industry come about because of the spirit and the grit of those immigrants. Parents who worked extremely hard to make sure that their children had a better opportunity than they did. But the legal ground and the actions of immigration have a history of either poor legislation, no legislation, hasty legislation, or probably the most frequently kicked the can down the road legislation we've ever seen. Legislation on immigration was a priority for Ronald Reagan, it was a priority for Clinton, it was a priority for Bush, and it's a priority for Obama. And yes, it's a campaign priority every 4 years. And guess what? We still don't have a solution. We know that the history of immigration changes over time. In fact, it spikes about every 30 years. If you go back into the 1800s, starting with the potato famine, in the 1800s, it started in 1850, we had a huge spike. In 1880, we had a huge spike. In 1920, we had a huge spike. And it goes on and on and on. And of course, in the 90s is the most recent spike. Shortly after those spikes, and this is what's interesting, the immigrants who were part of the previous spike are the ones who are most against the new immigrants coming in. It kind of sounds like Florida land use, you know, Sarasota. Well, there's many sides to this argument, and we're not going to necessarily have a debate today as much as we are discussion. And once again, Tiger Bay has done a wonderful job of bringing together a panel of people who have a strong interest in this. I'm going to start by introducing him a little bit, telling you a little bit about him. Christian Ziegler, if you'll start making your way up here. Christian Ziegler is a Republican state committeeman. He has spent his career promoting conservative causes at all levels of government. Prior to being elected to the state committeeman, Christian worked for U.S. Congressman Vern Buchanan in his Capitol Hill office, and he was responsible for legislation appearing before the Veterans Affairs Committees. Christian has also worked for numerous presidential campaigns on the conservative side, and we welcome him today. We also have Mr. Kelly Kirshner. Where's Kelly? Kelly, start making your way forward. Interesting, he is the Dean of Special Projects and Programs of Continuing Education at Eckerd College in St. Pete. He was raised in Sarasota. He's a graduate of Georgetown International Politics with a master's in Latin American Studies. At Georgetown, he worked as a head manager, believe it or not, for the basketball team. They didn't do it this year, but they're good. And what's more importantly, I was impressed with his background for the U.S. Peace Corps and a volunteer in rural Guatemala. He is fluent in Spanish. Kelly has recently completed 4 years as the youngest city commissioner ever elected in the city of Sarasota. And then we have Lutz, if I don't mess this up, Lutz Corqueta. There you go. I'm sorry, Lutz. I even asked her to give it to me phonetically so I couldn't mess it up too bad. Lutz is the program director for Healthy Start Coalition in Manatee County. She is originally from Peru. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in pastoral ministry. She has a very, very strong interest in helping kids all around the state, those who are here documented, undocumented, citizens or not, in making sure that we have an understanding and an early start in our education system. So we're going to go on down the road and get some things talking about. We have a list of questions we want to talk about, and then we're going to kind of open it up to some questions and see where we go. Most people acknowledge that the country could not afford to deport somewhere between 11 and 13 million people, not only given the cost of enforcement and mass deportation, but also the cost of the economy and our communities if millions of workers were deported and their families were separated. So the question is, and I'll ask each of the panels to give me a little bit of discussion on each subject, and we'll go from there and we'll have closing at the end. So I'm going to ask the panel, and Kelly, we'll start with you. Should we allow amnesty for those who are already here if they can prove they are working and paying taxes.
Thanks, Mike, and thank Tiger Bay for holding this important conversation, and then particularly to our media outlets that are covering it too, and METV, Channel 7. I saw Jeremy Wallace here, and hopefully that'll ratchet up some heat on our local congressman to actually have this conversation with us, which it's been a little bit difficult over the past number of years just to start that conversation. And I think that goes to Senator Bennett's question regarding amnesty, and maybe I bet if we polled this room, what is amnesty, we'd probably find, at least maybe 10 different answers. If you go back to our last president who actually passed a comprehensive immigration reform bill, President Reagan, that was called an amnesty, which really was an immediate amnesty. If you look at Senator Rubio's bill that is co-sponsored by 4 Democrats and 3 other Republicans that passed in the Senate, what some people in our House of Representatives are calling amnesty, other people say it's the furthest thing from amnesty, that you would require 10 years. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. Thanks, Senator. It would require 10 years of after the bill would be passed and signed into law, 10 years before you could even apply to get your green card, an additional 3 years after that you would actually be able to then process your citizenship. So that's 13 years as still a secondary citizen, if you will, or a secondary member of our community. I think in addition to that, there is a significant fine associated with it. A lot of people would think amnesty would suggest there is no fine, there is no punishment for the fact that you broke a civil law with it. So I don't know if I'm giving a politician's answer to it, but I think we frequently, unfortunately, want to have these black and white conversations about something that, whether we like it or not, is a difficult issue. That we have 11 million people in the United States that are living here without documents right now. We have estimated potentially between the 2 counties 30 to 50,000 undocumented residents that live here in Sarasota and Manatee counties. Many of those people, as what you see on your table there, that the image of the family sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner, thanking Jesus for their Thanksgiving meal. And then there's this individual in our local fields whose name is Jesus, and he's saying, "De nada, you're welcome." The fact being that, we really have, for far too long, as Mike said at the outset, have made this a political piñata of driving perhaps people and they're really tapping into their visceral fears and perhaps biases on how they might feel about the issue, when we're not really, I think, truly recognizing, that these are people that are living in our communities. That if you look at the past construction boom that we had, and you talk to any general contractor like Mike or folks like that and ask them about the job sites at Lakewood Ranch or around the eastern part of our communities, that were 80%, of the individuals on those job sites speaking Spanish, that I think it's time that we have a much more mature conversation about this and do what Governor Scott has done. If you ask any political scientist, Governor Scott is sitting in the governor's mansion because he took the Arizona bill of Show Me Your Papers, which is really an anti-immigrant bill passed in Arizona. Bill McCollum said, we don't need that law in the state of Florida. That was taped on a tape recorder by a reporter. That was used then in what's estimated to be about $10 to $12 million worth of radio and TV ads in the Republican primary to knock who was the front runner out of the GOP race, saying he doesn't support that law. Since then, I think Governor Scott's had that nuanced understanding. He's actually went and met with citrus farmers, tomato farmers, and others, and realizes that it's really not that easy to kick out hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants in the state of Florida, many of whom that our Secretary of Agriculture, Adam Putnam, will tell you are critically important to the agriculture industry that grew by $1 billion in exports during the height of the recession. So it's not an easy issue. It's critical to the state of Florida. We have many families that are mixed status families, where we have children that are born here, whether you like our Constitution or not, that are born here that are U.S. citizens, and we are deporting their parents and splitting up families and making these children then wards of the state. And I think there's some fundamental things that we should contemplate about the values of our country and what it is that we're doing when we do that, and which is why, as Mike said, it's time to stop kicking the can, get off the dime, and do something.
Lutz, you want to add to that?
Well, thank you, Senator Bennett, and thank you to the Tiger Bay for the opportunity to have a conversation. I connected with Senator Bennett on the phone, and I said, I hope that we can have a useful conversation and maybe something model that Washington is incapable of doing. Just talk about this issue as friends, as compassionate people. The issue of amnesty is something that confuses people when they are about to vote. Amnesty is something that allows people to remain, it's a pardon without any conditions. In this case, we are talking about comprehensive, humane immigration reform. As Kelly was mentioning, we have 11 million people that worship with us, that work for us, that shop, pay taxes, contribute to the economy. And many people think that they are breaking the law by staying here without the proper documentation. And while they are breaking the law, it's because there is a root cause, which we call poverty. Immigration is not a phenomenon only known to the United States with south of the border neighbors. It's a global phenomenon. 2/3 of the world live in extreme poverty. So in this room, I'm sure there are many parents. If I ask you, would you do anything for your children? I bet the answer is going to be yes. Those families who venture to come here want to provide a life of dignity for their children. They don't have the means to support their children, and they risk their lives. One of the issues that we have about deportation, it's a double punishment, because these people are working here, and all of a sudden they have a traffic violation. I would ask if anybody has never had a traffic violation here and broke the law in some ways. They are being arrested for minor violations and then connected with immigration enforcement and being deported without due process. In many cases, there are those detention centers where families are spending more than 6 months without a hearing, without a lawyer. What really concerns me the most right now is this talk about self-deportation. If we make the laws harder, people will choose to leave. Guess what? It's not happening. It's not going to happen. There are some children now that are traveling unaccompanied, without a parent, without an adult, and that is a big concern. The United Nations actually had been in conversations with the Central American countries and the United States to make sure that those children who are detained without a lawyer, they have an advocate or someone that speaks for them. And most of the times, those kids are caught in human trafficking situations, in sexual abuse. In 2013, it was estimated that 60,000 minors were crossing the border without parents and without papers. ICE has gotten into the practice of arresting people at the courts. There is an example here. You know, many people say, no, that doesn't happen in Sarasota, Manatee. It is happening in our own backyard. There is a family who is very hardworking. The kids were excelling in school. He was caught at 4 in the morning after he was leaving work because he was suspicious, they say. Tail light was broken in his car. He was arrested, and then he was bailed, and he was given a date in court. As he was making his way to the judge's chambers, he was arrested by ICE. He was put on a car, sent to Miami. His family was terrified. They didn't know what was happening to him. And then in 24 hours, he was deported. And this man was devastated. His family was devastated. It seems like the police probably are thinking that this is a very creative work, that now they try to find out who are the individuals who are here undocumented and find, you know, normal offenses that they probably have, and then just get rid of them without thinking about the cost, the loss of family, the loss of property, the loss of their own dignity. As this man was talking to me on the phone when he was deported, he said that what really hurt him the most was that He was not even given his own clothing when he was put at the border. And he had $300 in his pocket that he was going to use to pay his fines. However, there were so many other people who didn't even belong to Mexico, and he had to share his money for them to get transportation to their own families. And he said it was terrifying for him to know that, not knowing if he was going to see his family or not. And the problem is that even though the law enforcement, local law enforcement, and ICE they are not necessarily on the same page, because 2 days after, they went into his wife's home, they terrified the children, they had a photograph of him, and they were looking for him because he missed his date in court. What I did is I talked to a couple of judges in the 12th Circuit and brought this to their attention. They were not aware that people were being picked up right at the courthouse. So those are injustices that a comprehensive immigration reform can change. They don't come here because they want to be a threat to the country. They come here because they want to provide a better life to their children, and they contribute to our economy, and they are part of our society. And I look at them as my brothers and sisters because I have the privilege to work with all these families. I know how hardworking they are, and their employers praise them for their work ethic. And they take the jobs that most of us would not take. And so I am from a place where I witness every day their pain, their sorrow, and I see what the separation of their families does to their children. Those are the families that we should be trying to keep, not to get rid of.
Thank you, Liz. Christian.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks for hosting us. Thank you for hosting us. I mean, this is a very difficult conversation and issue, and it's one that I wish Washington would have more. I had the privilege of working for Congressman Buchanan up in D.C., and I'll tell you, very rarely do issues actually get discussed, and do they get in depth on issues. It's more, talking points and all that kind of stuff that's going on up there. A little story about, my background, and I'm going to come at this from a different angle, obviously. First, I do want to clarify in the program it said for and against immigration reform. What I will share with you is I don't know anyone that's really against immigration reform. I think there's differences in opinions on how we should address it. I think everyone kind of realizes that it's an issue that needs to be fixed, it needs to be discussed, it needs to be addressed. But I would hope that we would have serious conversations on each individual aspect of immigration reform versus putting together an entire bill. My father lives over in Serbia, former Yugoslavia. My grandfather lived in Serbia, former Yugoslavia. My great-grandparents are all from that area. I have two brothers that live over there. They're Serbian and Hungarian. And they're all doctors. Whole family's doctors. My brother's a dentist. Everyone else were doctors. If they tried to get in our country, it's different because they're obviously a relative. They would bypass with their relationship with me. But if I was not related to them, they would have a very difficult time getting in this country. And I would argue that those are the exact people that we would want to recruit to our country. The highly skilled, the highly educated, the job creators that will come in, make a contribution into society, create jobs that Americans can fill and work for to support their families. So, I think it's important that as we talk about immigration reform, it's not just talking about the people that are coming over this country legally and breaking laws by coming over they willingly came over the border and illegally entered our country and broke a law knowingly. I think that's important to keep in mind. But I think it's also to keep in mind that our legal immigration system is broken. And that needs to be part of the discussion. And when we start talking about like the Senate bill, and this is where I really oppose the Senate bill personally, is I think every section of that Senate bill deserves a conversation. It deserves a discussion. And there's key aspects that all Americans agree on. I think the majority of people, when you chat with them, they support securing the border. And I think that's something that we need to focus on, right? I mean, and I hate to simplify it too much, but really if you have, and I tell my friends this, is if you have a spill, if you have a leak in your house, you don't go grab the mop and start mopping up and trying to fix the issue that way. What do? You turn off the pipe, you fix the pipe, And then you move forward, and then you clean up this bill, and then you have a discussion where you need to be at. So I think when we start talking about the immigration reform bill, again, we need to focus on securing the border, an issue most Americans agree with. We need to enforce our laws. We need to start beginning to enforce our laws fairly, but also strictly. And then we need to look at the legal immigration system and fix that. At that point, I think it's definitely we should have a conversation with the people that are here. I don't know many people that really suggest that we should just deport all illegals. I think would be very difficult to do, and I don't find many people that support that position. I hear from a lot of people on this issue. So I think that's important to do, but I also don't trust our government really to enforce laws they enact if they quickly push it through. I mean, I think you see this with the healthcare law and all these other laws that they quickly push through Congress because really, and we kind of had this conversation the other day, is, you know, members of Congress are up for election every 2 years, which is really tough because the very next day they start running for re-election. So it makes it it's an environment that it's very difficult to deal with, you know, big issues. But I would hope that we would take this immigration reform bill, break it into sections, and start having a discussion, because there are going to be cases with, as you mentioned, you know, illegals with their children here that are Americans, and what do you do with the families, and what do you do with people that are willing to serve in the military but may be illegal, go to college, in-state tuition. All these things should be line items that we break apart and have a serious conversation on, versus lumping it all together, passing it, holding our fingers together and hoping that it gets worked out, right? So that's my position on this, and I really hope that our leaders would listen to that and really consider addressing it that way.
Senator, you mind if we have just a little bit of give and take? And I think we might want to time that give and take too, but I think it might be helpful to draw out this conversation and the talking points that Christian was referring to as well.
Okay, we'll come right back to it, but I want to talk about the border security.
Sure.
Okay. Obviously, border security is an issue, but I don't know that it's really the issue that's... I always find the federal government wants to secure a 2,000-mile border with a 300-mile fence. Only the federal government can do that. But let's
The fence is even...
Well, it's true. But let's talk about...
And then they build a bigger ladder.
That's right. Let's talk about border security. What percentage, and I've heard some numbers, what percentage of the people come into our country illegally versus those who come here legally and stay? I've heard numbers of around 40, maybe even closer to 50% of the people who are here that are undocumented truly came here legally. They came here on a work visa, student visa. Does anybody have any input on that?
Yeah, you know, I was reading about that the other day, and actually I heard 1/3. So 1/3 of the people come into the country legally, they're here to visit, and then they just decide not to go back, which obviously turns them into illegal immigrants as well. So I've heard the 1/3 figure with the 2/3 coming across the border.
A good number from Canada too, Mike. But we never talk about securing that border either.
And I think but I think when I talk about border security, I guess I'm talking about border security, and I think that's what you're saying, Kelly. If we're going to talk about a southern border, what about a northern border? And If we're going to talk about that, why wouldn't we also talk about the air border,
Sure,
of people
sure.
coming in?
Yeah.
And so I don't know how you go about that kind of security discussion.
So, I think the discussion starts with, and I'll push Christian on it just so we can have some fun here, but I didn't hear an answer on the amnesty, and I think that's important that we understand how is Christian defining amnesty that might give us an idea that how do we broach that issue, and how do we discuss it in terms of, you know, how do we secure our borders, and you know, I completely understand every 2 years we have congressional elections. We have so gerrymandered our congressional districts that no one is really scared of actually having a debate about what is the center of centrist policy in America. We're scared of the attacks from either the far right or the left, which is why we can't even have these conversations, as Christian pointed out too. But I would hope that, you know, in this community where we have close to 300 people attend this conversation today. I was telling some people at the table, I'm working in St. Pete and Tiger Bay. You're lucky if you get 60 to 80 people at Tiger Bay conversations, including when you have Will Weatherford, Speaker of the House, there a few months ago. So I would hope if there's a community that can model the behavior and conversations that Luce was talking about, that it would be Sarasota. So I'd like to know, you know, from Christian, from Vern and others, what is amnesty? And how can we do that? In terms of secure the border, which is one of these talking points that you're hearing constantly from, you know, some of the folks in Washington that don't want to move off the dime. There's people that say we have to hermetically seal our border with Mexico before we can even contemplate comprehensive immigration reform. We've put on, I think, everyone's table this a group out of Princeton that's been studying the border with Mexico for, I think, close to nearly 50 years. For the past 3 years, we've had net negative migration from Mexico. That means we've had more people returning to Mexico than we have had crossing over. So that I think, is the first sign. You now have a Democratic president who's now being derided as the deporter-in-chief. In his 6 years in office, he's deported more individuals than any other president in the history of the United States. So I don't know if we can't talk about this conversation now and we have to secure the border, when that's going to happen. The other side to Mike's question is, well, what do we do? When you're talking about amnesty, I guess we should talk about amnesty for all of the corporations that have knowingly been hiring these people, and no one talks about the penalties for them as well. And so clearly we've cast a blind eye. When we had functionally zero unemployment here, when we were building everything out at Lakewood Ranch, no one said a word about, that we need to pass these laws in the state of Florida to get these people out of here, because they were helping to drive the machine. And so shame on us that we can't recognize that these are families with children that are serving your food probably right here in this room right now, that we can't start to have the conversation and actually get off the dime. And so I would love to see
Congress. Let's take a shot at that.
Yeah, and I would love to see Congress start piecemeal by piecemeal, but you're not seeing that either. The talking points that you're seeing is they can't trust this president to pass the law or to enforce the law.
Kelly.
Can I just say something?
Hold on. You know why I'm up here? Guess what I get to do?
I tend to be the mom everywhere, so.
Okay, hold on. But I want to go back to something that
do I get to respond on
Christian?
this?
Yeah.
Okay.
How would you describe amnesty?
So, and again, that's a great conversation to have, right? Talking about definition of amnesty. And Kelly and I are going to obviously have a fundamental disagreement on this. And my position, again, I just go back and the border needs to be secured. And I'll share why. Ronald Reagan. Darling of the right. All Republicans love Ronald Reagan, right? Great guy, great representative of the party. In 1986, he signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which granted amnesty, instant amnesty, to 4 million people. What happened in that bill? When he pitched that bill to sell the bill, to get it passed, he ensured that the border would be secure, and he ensured that the employers would be cracked down on that employ illegals. So those were promises that were made. They passed the bill, 4 million people get amnesty, and we are now about 20 years out after that bill, and now we're at 11, 15 illegals. No one knows what the number is. So there's a big issue, is when you give amnesty and you don't secure the border first, what's going to happen? More people are going to come over because they're going to expect in another 20 years there's going to be a law passed that's going to give them instant citizenship. Or in another 5 years if there's political pressure. So you cannot address, in my opinion, you cannot address the amnesty issue until you stop the pipe. And that's the biggest issue here, in my opinion.
Christian, define amnesty, because what the Senate bill is not instant citizenship. It's 11 years with a fine. Define it.
So what I'll share with you is, that's right. So the Senate bill says they have to pay back taxes, they have to pay penalties, they have to be here for X number of years. Obama, a couple years ago, enacted a executive order. He bypassed Congress. Executive orders are crazy, right? I think these issues need to be addressed by Congress. He installed the DREAM Act. Basically, people that are in here that are, I think under 16, they came to the country before, and then they were here for 5 years, they would, be in line, they could waive the deportation rules. Now, part of that, actually, Obama wrote into the law, and he said, okay, there was, I think, I have the numbers in here, but there was like 440,000 that have applied for that, right, that have benefited from it. And in his executive order, he said everyone's going to get a background check, right? Everyone's going to get a background check. Out of the 430, I think it was like 10% got a background check. A couple months later, they stopped doing the background checks right after the election. So here's what they made a promise, and they said, we're going to give, we're going to let them, we're going to waive the rules or whatnot and not deport these individuals. They said there was background checks that were going to happen. They didn't happen. So my worry here is when we start doing amnesty and we start saying that you can get amnesty if you do this and you do this and you do this, that's great. That'll pass the law. And then what will happen? Once the law is enacted, once it's signed by the president, whoever that is at the time, they can just willingly, and we've seen it with the healthcare law. I mean, however you stand on that, the facts are the facts. Is he's willingly changed the healthcare law numerous times on his own through executive action, through ignoring the law and not enforcing the law. So if we have this amnesty that's based on certain line items, we pass it, I think there's a good chance that the federal government will stop enforcing those line items. And I think that's the risk here. And again, that's why before we have that conversation, I really think we need to secure the border first. And then definitely we need to start talking about the people that are here, and we need to start figuring out how we're going to address it. But it's a little silly to start talking about, in my opinion, to start talking about addressing it before the problem, before the initial flow isn't stopped. So,
Luz?
Well, in 2003, when President Bush folded both agencies, Immigration and Customs with law enforcement, they spent a big chunk of the budget trying to seal the borders or trying to build whatever they want to do.
Invisible fence.
The invisible fences and, sealing the air. We can try to be creative, and they can continue spending the billions of dollars that they are spending in police patrol and all these issues. However, if people are hungry, they're going to find a way to come here, whether it's crossing the river, building something bigger than the fence, making themselves invisible. They are going to try to come here. And so it's almost like we are talking about an impossible task, that you're going to seal all the borders with all the neighbors. I don't think that's going to happen. What we need to do is to have a system that allows people to work decently, to recognize that they are here, to avoid exploitation from the people that are using. Obviously, if they came here because people are saying back in Mexico or Central America that there are jobs available and they're going to get paid, people are going to come to try to work. And I think those who employ them are the ones who are at fault, because they pretend that they are not undocumented. And here, we pretend that this is not a problem. We have 11 million people who have been working, who have lived here for all their lives. And when you ask them, do they want to stay here forever? Probably the answer is no. They just came here to work. And they are contributing to Social Security. They are paying taxes. Are they going to be able to earn a pension? Never. It's something that will not be accessible to them. So let's really focus on the issue that we have an immigration system that it's broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for the highly skilled people. It doesn't work for the migrant farm workers that the growers badly need them. It doesn't work for any other occupation that we don't have enough workers for.
So I've actually spent 2 days with the Border Patrol on the border a couple of years back. And we toured, we were in the El Paso sector, right in Texas. It was fascinating, actually. And we toured the various areas that have the new fence and the areas that don't have the fence. We toured where the trucks are coming over and the cars are coming over. We toured the drug departments that are, capturing drugs and all this stuff. Actually, a funny story for the people here. Congressman Buchanan, I actually went on with him to a Codell because I handled his immigration issues, and we went to the border. And we went to the drug area, and this is just a side conversation, but it's pretty funny. So we went to the drug area, and he was handling the, there's marijuana in the room and all this stuff. So they're showing it to us and showing us brick after brick after brick. And then we went to the canine area, and the dogs went crazy. And we forgot to take it off of ourselves, obviously. So it was pretty funny. But, when I was on that border, one thing that really struck me is there is a complete difference on where the flow is coming from and not coming from. The big fence that they install, it's not perfect, actually. If you look at the fence that they're putting in the border, the new fence, the very secure fence, it goes about probably 25 feet high, or, don't quote me on it, 25 feet high. You can't climb it, which is good. But it starts like right at the ground level. Well, it's sand. You can kind of dig under it, so it's a little easy to really get under that fence. It's a little, federal government building the fence. Obviously, that's going to happen. But it does stop cars, because there are people that come in with cars, and we saw it. We actually were out there. We were with the Border Patrol at midnight. We turned off all the lights in the cars. We had our night vision on, and we're driving around the border, checking it out. And you see there are cars that will just drive right into the border. They'll park in a neighborhood. They'll all jump out and scatter, right? So the fence does help with that. Now, can we secure our border? Absolutely. There's a lot of countries out there that are able to secure their borders, are able to watch their borders better. We're America. We can secure the borders if we want to.
But nobody else wants in those.
Excuse me?
But nobody else seems to want into those countries.
No. Well, I mean, and that kind of, so that, so.
I mean, I never see any inner tubes going the other way.
But yeah, well, so that kind of addresses, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, that, you know, you mentioned, I think 2/3 of the world is in poverty, and as long as there's poverty, people are going to want to come to our country. Well, we have to realize that. And we have to know that we're going to be a destination for a lot of these people that are in poverty that want to come over to our country. And really, to be frank, and we're at a point where we have, and I hate to say it, I mean, at some point, I hope Tiger Bay, and I don't know if you've had this discussion, but we need to start talking about the expenses that our country has incurred. And we're here with a national debt surpassing $17.5 trillion. Trillion. We throw the health care law on top of it. We throw our spending with the military around the world on top of it. And you start talking about finances that are just running wild. And at some point, we got to take a step back.
I want to talk about immigration.
What?
I want to talk about
No, I
immigration.
know. Hold on.
If he wants to talk about it, Mike, it's the one budgetary issue that's
No, you don't
good
understand.
for the deficit, though.
It's my
Immigration
show.
reform will help
It's
that.
my show. It's the Mike
All
Bennett
right,
show.
yeah.
No,
My
but-
wife told me before I got here, she says, make sure you understand you're the moderator, you're not the talker.
You want my
Okay?
stop
So
clock?
hold on, but I want to ask you a
I'll
question.
start keeping time for you, too.
I also read an interesting
Well, I
statistic.
think I should probably get double the time, but that's just my
But
opinion.
listen to
Maybe
this.
not.
This is an interesting question, because I read the statistic the other day. I had a good meeting, and I think a lot of you know Keith Fitzgerald. Keith Fitzgerald is really an interesting guy who happens to be a friend of mine, and yes, he's on the other side of the political fence. But his master's or his doctorate thesis was on immigration. Okay, and so he really gave me some insight the other day as I was preparing for this. And one of the statistics that came out, and I wanted to ask the panel on this, was securing the borders. One of the statistics shows as the borders have become more and more secure, as we have hired more and more agents, and we have spent more and more money, we've actually exasperated the number of people who came into our country and stayed. And the theory is because they used to come across, sneak across the border, go over and pick the citrus, go back to Mexico. Now it's become so pricey and so dangerous, they don't go home anymore. They stay here.
And they bring their family that they
thoughts?
didn't do before.
Thoughts? Kelly? Thoughts?
Yes, I completely agree. Previously, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, it would be primarily the man of the household would come for the growing season, would go back home. They would not bring their families. By virtue of that heightened enforcement, they do bring their families. I just want to go back to a few things that Christian was talking about. We still didn't get the definition for amnesty. I believe if we pass a law, the president doesn't enforce the law, it's an impeachable offense. I really think that that's a specious argument to say.
You don't
that
want to get me started on that.
All right. Well, and again, if we're going to stop kicking the can, then let's start doing it piecemeal. One of the other items I would say is when I was an elected official, Elie Wiesel was brought to town and spoke at the Van Wezel. And he commented on the Germany pre-World War II, and he said, words are powerful, and this comes from a great writer. And when the way words are used and they're appropriated by elected officials, then they gain more power. And when those officials are starting to put in place policy, then it becomes power that translates into evil. And certainly you saw that in what took place in the Holocaust and what the Nazi regime did. One of, I think a pet peeve for Luce, myself, many of the supporters of Unidos Now that are here is the constant use of the term illegals. That we don't really talk about. And it's kind of this dehumanization of, again, these people that live within our community. And we talk about 11 million, 15 million. These are numbers that they don't mean anything. But if you look locally and you bring this down locally and you talk about illegals, there is a reason that Luce says that these people sit in jail for 6 months without any legal counsel. It's because it's a civil infraction. It is not a criminal infraction that would give them guaranteed right to counsel. So it's actually a civil violation and violating our immigration code. And so so to call them illegals is to call you an illegal because you ran through a stop sign. And I think it's part of this conversation that we should be mindful of starting to change that we have people like Jose Vargas, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist here in the United States, who is undocumented, and he goes to many events and he'll wear a placard around his neck that says, "I'm an American without papers." And again, you know, this conversation that's interminable. I was in Texas a few weeks ago. The same types of TV ads that Rick Scott ran 4 years ago, they're running in Texas now to beat this, you know, that the villain that hurts our economy is the immigrant. There's a Mark Twain quote that it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And it's this kind of visceral reaction that it's this immigrant that is, you know, depressing wages and stealing jobs and hurting us. Well, the fact of the matter is, we have a baby boom tsunami that's going to be overtaking not only Sarasota, that's the oldest county by median age in the United States, but it's going to be overtaking the country. And the true facts of the matter is, if you look at public policy conversations in Europe that are actually paying women to stay home from work to have more children, the United States actually, not only do we need the 11 million that actually balance that generational cycle of having people of working age that are paying taxes, building our community and doing these things, that we actually need to have a conversation about a lot more than 11 million immigrants that are being productive, that, by the way, these are individuals that are already being productive in our society and economy now. We need to be thinking about a lot more. So unfortunately, this conversation that we're having that's completely unproductive, it denies people their humanity. It denies us of what I think all of us value is the American experience and valuing the core of families that, as Luz can tell you, these families that she works with every day. We need to get to the right conversation as fast as possible.
You know, it's interesting, and I've heard that conversation. Lutz and I talked about it when I interviewed her as far as the term illegal immigrant. And yet I go back to, if they're not here legally and they are an immigrant, then they're an illegal immigrant. It's kind of like putting lipstick on a pig and not calling it a pig. And it's really a shame, and I know that there's been a huge move in the society to get rid of the term, but sometimes in our society I've found that changing the terms and trying to rewrite history doesn't get it.
Well, there was a great downtown partnership event that I went to in 2006 with Senator Bennett, and he said, raise your hand to a room full of business people. He said, raise your hand if you haven't skirted around the law or pushed the law or violated the law a little bit to get ahead in life. So I'll take it from our moderator's mouth that being illegal is good then.
Now,
so, you know,
it's interesting. You know, I was certainly looked at many a wet green card when I was in the construction business because I needed labor. Let's go back to something you were just, and we can both talk about it. The E-Verify. Do you think it should be mandatory that all businesses use the employment verification system, E-Verify, and why?
I think E-Verify is already in place, especially for organizations that receive state or federal funding. And I think we should make employers accountable for hiring the people that have the right documentation. And if they really need them, they should start a process to allow them to get into the right path. Right now, for instance, we have the agricultural worker visa program, the H-2A, that doesn't have enough people. The workers are aging. Those who came in the 1990s are aging. They are not capable of performing those very difficult duties in the field. And so the Western Growers Association is really complaining and threatening to remove their political support and their financial resources to the politicians if they don't reform, if they don't fix this problem. And so E-Verify is like a Band-Aid, but I think there's got to be responsibility from those who hire people, but especially if they have created a path to oppress, to pay them low wages. And E-Verify may not work for everyone, but I think it's a responsibility of the employers, and we cannot put these on the people that are being offered these jobs, and they are being underutilized and forced to live in the shadows and beneath the system.
So, I don't know if everybody understands what E-Verify is. If you go to Michael's on East right now and you say, I want to be a server, they'll give you a job application that says, fill out your Social Security number. So you can make up an 8-number digit, and they'll send it in to be processed. It takes the Social Security Administration a year to send Michael's on East HR department back a message that says, hey, Mike filled out his W-9, and it doesn't match with anyone that exists in our database. Will you go back and ask him again? They'll ask Mike again. It'll take them an additional 6 months. So that's 18 months for them to say, you're employing someone who it appears is living here undocumented, which is why Lou said, we have people, that's now the suspense account for Social Security Administration is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not accounting for any interest, of these people that, let's be honest again, that work in the service industry. They're getting a check. They're not paying them cash. They're paying Social Security benefits that they will never get. And that's where this money is going, and it's sitting in a suspense account. So the E-Verify program is that no longer would happen. It's a digital system. Michael's on East would have to submit that digitally, and immediately they would get something back. That number doesn't match. Try again or tell them they can't work for you. And so that is part of the Gang of Eights bill that was passed in Congress. I agree with Luce, and how is it different that Christian asked from '86 and what Ronald Wilson Reagan did? It's different in that employers can't do it anymore. And so it's kind of like the drug war. It's the worst war we've ever fought. We have a cheaper, more potent, more accessible product on every corner of America after spending billions of dollars. And so if you want a good war, then you stop the demand for labor. And so you stop the demand by having a system that people know they won't be able to get a job.
Now you know why Kelly was the politician, let's suppose. Yeah. Okay, before I go to questions, I wanted to touch on something else that's near and dear to most of the people in this room. The Florida House of Representatives just passed a bill that would let qualified Florida students pay in-state tuition rates even if they are in the country illegally. The bill would grant a tuition waiver for high school graduates who attend a Florida school for 4 consecutive years, regardless of that immigration status. Maybe our own in-state DREAM Act. Give us an input on that, Lutz, since you work with children.
Yes. First of all, I want to go back to something that Christian said earlier about President Obama passing the DREAM Act. No, it didn't pass. It was short of 5 votes, which is a shame, because those kids came here when their parents brought them when they were children. Why are we punishing children for the mistakes or the decisions the parents make? Have you ever been to jail and you had to take your children? No. I think it's important that we start looking at those children as our future because they are here. This is the only country that they know. This is the only country that they've learned to love. And when they have a dream to pursue higher education, we need to allow them to do that. We don't need to punish them. We invest in them to go through elementary, high school, middle school, and then when they get to 12th grade, there is no investment anymore. We tell them that they can't go any farther because they are undocumented, and some of them didn't even know they were undocumented. So even though the solution is not for the state to find an alternative to support these young talents, it's a step. By allowing them to pay in a state tuition, they are not doing something outrageous because these are residents. Whether we like it or not, these kids have been living in Florida for a long time. Their parents are paying taxes. In many ways, when those kids are shopping, have you ever seen, I have a friend, Oscar Chacon, who is with an association that advocates for Latin American communities, and he said, when you go to the store, do you have 2 lines, 2 cashiers, one that says undocumented pay here, and the other one regular people pay here? No, they pay taxes the same way we do. So it's about time that these kids are allowed to pursue higher education. And what President Obama did with the fair action.
Lutz, I don't want to talk about President Obama. I want to talk about Florida State, okay? And the
the deferred action, Senator Bennett, is something that has helped those young people to be able to have a name, to be able to be visible, and to be able to pursue higher education and maybe hold jobs.
No, it's, I'm disappointed. We're going to have the same conversation in 20 years. If we don't address the core root of the problem, we're going to have the same exact conversation in 20 years. When you start, you talk about in-state tuition, no one's saying they can't necessarily not go to college. We're having a discussion about them getting a discount that other Americans wouldn't get. We're talking, I actually grew up in Atlanta. I went to school at Florida State. I was on Florida prepaid, so that helped me. But if I were to go to Florida State University from Georgia and I didn't have Florida prepaid, I would have paid out-of-state tuition, correct? Yes, not subsidized education. In my belief, and actually Bill Clinton signed the law, I oppose this action. So I oppose the bill that was passed, or I think it's working its way through. Bill Clinton signed a law that actually in 1996, I think is what it was, that, the line is pretty specific, and it basically says that no state can give a benefit to an illegal for higher education, in-state tuition, unless that same benefit is offered to all Americans around the country. So that's where the issue is it's not that they can't go to college. And let's have a real conversation. Let's talk about facts. Let's talk about the issue. Because what you'll see is there's people on the far right that'll say certain things that will try to scare people on it and everything. And then there's people on the left, which is kind of happening here a little bit, in my belief, that will try to over-humanize and really spotlight this and bring up examples that aren't true. Like personally, I just heard that they wouldn't be able to pursue higher education. That's not true. They're able to pursue it just like anyone else going to a college outside of their state, and it would just cost them the same, and it wouldn't be subsidized by the taxpayers. Again, I go back to our debt. I go back to all the issues we're putting up, putting on the books with all these various laws, whether it's from the federal government, the state level, or the local level. And at some point, we have to look at ourselves as Americans, and we really have to take care of ourselves. We have to rein in the spending, and I'm not necessarily saying it's all the health care law, it's all this, because we have a lot of wars that we go in that cost us a lot of money, so we can look at that. We need to look at the healthcare law. We need to look at all these other regulations and all these other laws that are put in that really cost us a lot of money. But we need to have a conversation. We need to look at the immigration issue, and we need to realize that these are expenses that are going to go on the books. And just like any other business, it's too bad the federal government's not run like a business, but just like any other business, you have to look at the cost versus the benefit. You have to look at the realities, and the reality is we have people here that are willfully breaking the law. They came over here. No one dragged them over here. No one kidnapped people and brought them over here. They willfully either walked over, they willfully came from another country, and it's not just Mexico. It's not. These are people that are coming from Europe, coming from other countries. I know some that fly in, they go to Disney World for a couple days, and they don't return. We need to address it. But again, Mike, just real quick, we're having a conversation here on amnesty for illegals right now versus really having a conversation on securing the border and revamping the legal immigration system. That is not being talked about, and that's what needs to happen first, in my opinion.
Let me, it's interesting. I read a statistic the other day, then I'm going to go to questions, that if Florida passes the in-state tuition for the undocumented, it could cost as many as 5,000 students in the state of Florida a lost opportunity to attend some of the Florida universities because we don't have the capacity to do both of them. But let's open it up for discussion. Yes, ma'am, you've been standing there patiently, and I think everybody knows the rules. You must be a Tiger Bay member, and please state your name, and if you have a question for a specific, please say so. If not, we'll dance around it. So.
Good afternoon, Senator Bennett. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Tiger Bay. My name is Millicent Puleo, and I am a proud American and a Hispanic ethnicity. I do take issue with Bill 851. FAIR, which is a national progressive media group, watchdog, states that exactly what you just finished stating. 5,000 citizen students, being a mother of 3 daughters, will be displaced. And I am very, bothered by this, that we had quite a few, 38 Florida House rhinos supporting this. I am very glad, Senator Bennett, that the panel is balanced today, and thank God for clarity, because there are 2 sides to a coin. I am a strong fiscal conservative, and I truly believe in toughening our borders and sealing them. Because yes, I am a small business owner, and we had Mohammed Atta rent vehicles from mine, and I think everyone here, our business knows what happened on 9/11.
Mohammed Atta was here legally, ma'am.
Time out. Whoa. No, time out. I know. Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you.
We
okay?
medicate and incarcerate the bad.
If you're not going to let me, just please ask a question, okay? All I'm looking for from people, otherwise we'll never get to it. If you're going to come up and ask a question, I will cut you off. I think everybody knows that I can be really ugly at times, so please don't do it. If you have a specific question, but please don't tell me a story. Go ahead.
Who here on the panel is in favor of displacing 5,000 American students in place of the illegal students? That's my question. Thank you.
I think that's a rhetorical question. I don't think anybody wants to answer that question. Dan Bailey.
I've already tipped Kelly and Christian off, but I have this question.
What about me?
If you could, and you were there too.
Oh, okay.
If you could enact legislation on the federal level that would address the issues we talked about today beyond the question of sealing the border, assume that we would seal the border, what would the specific features of that legislation consist of? Who would get amnesty, however you define it? What conditions would be attached, etc.? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Let's take a shot at it.
So the first one, this assumption on sealing the border. Let's honestly be honest. It's like what is it, Sisyphus pushing the ball up the hill. It's not going to happen. It's 3,000 miles. We I think, invested $500 million in this electric fence over a 3-year period, and it was a monumental disaster, and maybe Christian can tell us about his...
Assume
All right, so...
In fact, as I'm going to ask the panel also, since we're running quickly out of time.
Yeah, so number
to
one...
the point and to the brief.
I agree with Christian. There should be no amnesty. There should be a fine. And you know what? We have every undocumented immigrant that I've ever talked to said, give me the fine. Is it, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000? I'll go get a loan. I'll do it. Buy down the deficit. I will pay the fine. Is there a line? Tell me where it is and I'll take my pillow and I'll sleep there. So don't give them amnesty. Have a fine and make them work with a lengthy period of time before they get to a green card point and then before they get to citizenship. Everyone's in agreement with that. You had a bipartisan agreement. And by the way, Marco Rubio is a Tea Party candidate in the state of Florida that led the charge on that. So this is not some far left, type of thing, that conversation. What's far left, or what is really to the far spectrum, is that is somehow some radical bill and that's amnesty. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is accountability to employers in the future. We can transfer by the click of a mouse, billions of dollars from country to country. We haven't figured out how do we move labor back and forth to pick our crops here. I think everybody in this room would say we want to make sure we have a regulated and strong agricultural industry in the state of Florida in the United States. If we don't figure out how we're going to move labor back and forth, we're not going to have that. And we've had welfare to fields programs throughout many states in this country. Every single one has been a major disaster. The American does not want to go out and pick your tomatoes. They do not want to go out and pick your...
So,
Again, stick to the questions, otherwise we're never
well,
going to
so
get through it.
the answer is...
What would you put in the perfect bill?
The E-Verify needs to go in there. That you can't get a job until you're legal.
That's one.
It needs to be what the Gang of Eight have already put in there, that has a fine, it is a period of getting to citizenship. If you have a felony conviction, you are not allowed. If you have a felony conviction during that 10-year period, you will be deported. I think the last one is recognizing the ag industry and getting back to where we used to be, that people can come and go, but it can't be mired in bureaucracy like what Luce was talking about with the current H-2A system, where we have elected officials that J.D. Alexander said on the floor of the Senate when Mike was still there, I can't use H-2A, but by the time I'll process the paperwork, my crop will be rotten on the ground. So we need to get to those levels, and I think you have a bill that works.
Luke, Christian, fine.
I've been to the border. There's a clear difference in a secure border and an unsecure border. Watched it firsthand. So that's number one. Number two, what would I do? One of the pieces that I would really focus on is I think we really need to change the H-1B. And there's a lot of people that say we don't want immigrants coming here and we don't want immigration, and I disagree with that, right? So I think that we need all the highly skilled, all the educated people that want to come to America and make America great. We shouldn't have a cap. Right now I think the cap's 80,000 H-1B H-1B visas. And that goes out the day they're announced, the day they open up, They're all scooped up. And then we start rejecting the people like the Albert Einsteins of
Stay
the
with
world.
the points. Stay with the points. What would the ideal bill? Don't.
Yeah, I'm talking about the H-1B. I think we need to advance. This is what I'm talking.
Okay.
So I think the H-1B, right now, we have that cap on 80,000, and I think we need to increase that. And that goes into the legal immigration reform system, that there are some people that are out there. I read a story about a woman, she's waiting like 29 years to become a citizen legally. And I think that needs to be addressed, and that would be really the focus on the legal side.
Lutz?
I would say that assuming that everything is in place and people become really wise about discussing the issue of immigration, I think something like the Senate has already put in place would work to allow people first to have an identification that shows who they are, so we know who is living here, to allow them to be able to pay a fine, to learn English. I am a big proponent of people learning the language because I think it's important for them to be empowered to use their voice and not to depend on anybody else. Third, to welcome them in this country with open arms because for so long they've been living in the shadows. And fourth, I think the immigration system is broken in general. For instance, Christian was referring to the number of visas that we have, the H-1B visas, and we also have the TN, the L-1. They have very small caps. In 2013, there were 15,000 visa applications, and the cap was only under 9,000. Meanwhile, Canada has 120,000 visas for the highly skilled people. And also that the farm worker bill has to be reformed, and we have to allow the guest worker program, just very similar to what they have in Canada. When I used to live here, I would see at the airport hundreds of migrant workers who would come, and then they would leave after the season was over.
I'm going to give them each a real short wrap it up. Lutz, we're going to start with you. You're the lady.
Thank you.
Short.
I just want to say that this conversation has really reflected where the nation is at. It's almost like we have two minds when it comes to immigration reform and the treatment of undocumented people. The right brain sympathizes, but the left brain is fixed on illegality. At the national level, a compromise between those poles has created the word reform that gives emphasis to punishment over integration and allocates money to enforcement efforts. States and communities that are anti-immigrant will not thrive. Those that welcome them will. And that will shift the political equilibrium towards support for policies that integrate, attract, and retain immigrants no matter their status. There is a need for comprehensive, humane immigration reform. The states can only do so much. Reform will require moral courage and leadership. The current system invites unjust working conditions and even human trafficking, separates families through deportation and backlogs for lawful family reunification. It's not conducive to the full flourishing of people made in God's image. The only path towards meaningful comprehensive immigration reform lies in understanding the pernicious association of immigrants of color with terrorism and criminality. In crafting legislation, Congress should be more attuned to the failures of the past. Massive detention and deportation of immigrants is costly, tears families apart, and is more of a reflection of our country's paranoia of criminal outsiders than the reality of immigrant workers in search of economic and social stability. Using national security to justify the targeted removal of immigrants demeans the meaning of citizenship and the important role of immigrants in constituting the nation. Congress has an opportunity to act. The House should pass legislation that reflects American values, that provides economic opportunity and strengthens families. Doing the right thing takes not only wisdom, but courage. I pray that our political leaders will exercise both for the good of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Gentlemen, make sure you understand I'm a lot nicer to her than I am you. So, Kelly, how about a short wrap-up, my friend?
Thanks very much, Mike, and I've never seen you look ugly, so I appreciate everybody sticking here for as long as you have, and I don't have much more to add to what Lou said. I would say, though, that the longer we delay this, we as a community, we as a nation continue to just cut off our nose to spite our face. Christian said if they want to go to college, they can. Well, they pay not as an American citizen they pay as a foreign national, which is 4 times the amount of what you'd pay in in-state tuition. And these are talented people. And there's a girl that graduated from Booker's VPA with a 4.3 GPA, I think 2 years ago. She is not going to college, and she works at a high-end hotel here in Sarasota that employs her in spite of her legal status. I think that this country has been built on talent, that we appreciate talent. The demographics, if you want to look at demographics, the economics of this would dictate, beyond the humanity that Luce talks about, that we do this as fast as possible because of this demographic and aging of the American population, because of the reasons the Congressional Budget Office said that over the next 10 years, this will be, I think, close to $1 billion in terms of revenue positive income back to the federal government by virtue of comprehensive immigration reform. I think the data is all here. What we need to stop is the demagoguery, and you're going to see it again being heated up in this political cycle. And I would hope that, you know, it needs to be fought congressional district by district, having a conversation like this with your representative, and hopefully we can pass it soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Christian.
The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Federal government's responsible for enacting legislation and immigration policies. The federal government's responsible for enforcing those, and the federal government has really failed us in both ways. Kelly's right. I mean, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Obviously, where we disagree is how it needs to be addressed. And like I mentioned, in 1986, 4 million people were granted amnesty. The border was promised to be secure. That was a portion of the law. Employers, they promised to crack down on and, you know, make sure they're only hiring legal citizens. It didn't happen. I think we're teeing ourselves up for that. And we're at a critical stage right now where we have a national debt that's at $17.5 trillion. We have a lot of laws in the works. We have military all over the world that cost a lot of money. And I'm afraid, I mean, really, I worry that we address some of the aspects of immigration reform first before we stop it. We stop the flow of illegals over here. And I think in 10 years, 20 years, we might not be talking 11 million. I think we might be talking 20 million. We might be talking 25 million illegals here now. And then our debt will, you know, obviously be increasing as well. So, you know, I hope that we'll, as a country, take this law, separate the sections, and individually address each one and have a conversation in our communities, state, and in Congress on each individual aspect versus just pushing it through and hoping that it's going to go well. So, you know, that's kind of where I'm at, and I think it's important for us, you know, as a country, not just immigration, everything else, to be involved. These elected leaders, these policies, they're truly an investment. It's like anyone owning stock. You know, keep tabs of what your elected leaders are doing, why they're doing it, who's doing it right in your mind, who's not doing it, because at the end of the day, it's your investment as an American citizen. You're paying for it. So.
I got to tell you, you know, I really appreciate everybody sticking around. As you can see, it's not an easy subject. It's an emotional subject. I heard one time that somebody said that the United States, our country, was really a miracle when it came to democracy. And I've said it wasn't a miracle because nothing miraculous happened. It was all on blood, sweat, and tears of immigrants, the people who came here, the people who worked hard to do better for their children. I hope you all get a better understanding of it. I hope you vote your conscience, whichever it is. But remember, each of us are here because of somebody else, more than likely our grandparents. Thank you for coming to Tiger Bay.